Hi, Milan.
Hi there.
How are you? Sorry, I was on a call with Capital. Apologies for being late.
I'm sure we just all got our instructions, and I will punt to you at the get-go once we start the program.
Okay, sounds good. Let me just
So you'll be the first one off. I do a little bit of introduction and then move to you, Lana. I hope all is well.
All is well.
I think, as we said early on, you'd be better off in your capital right now than in New York. But
yeah, got used to it.
Okay, Ambassador, we are ready to.
Allie?
Yep, go ahead.
Welcome to this discussion on the post-conflict window, advancing women's role in economic recovery and climate resilience. I'm Elena Verveer, the director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And today's event is being co-hosted with the Permanent Mission of the United Arab Emirates and with the Irish Mission to the United Nations. We've had a long-standing partnership with the UAE in sponsoring a series of discussions over many years now on Security Council Resolution 1325 that links the agency of women to peace and security. Today's discussion is the second in this four-part series, co-hosted between the UAE and Ireland, in which we focus on the very important transition period after peace agreements are reached and the conflict-affected state moves to that critical transition period: relief, reconstruction, recovery. The failure to include women's participation in post-conflict decision-making can undermine the potential for a durable peace going forward. A range of critical investments and priorities, from creating economic opportunities, something we will discuss today, to writing constitutions, building democratic institutions, and so much more, is at stake in this critical post-conflict window. Today, we'll focus, as I said, on women's role in economic recovery and, attendant to that, climate resilience. We are being joined by over 800 participants from around the globe, from Afghanistan and Lebanon and to Argentina and the Philippines and so many other places. And we welcome each and every one of you. I also want to give a special welcome to the United Nations permanent representatives who are with us today. They are many in numbers and I won't name them, but welcome to each and every one of you as well. And to the many leaders of multilateral organizations and grassroots women's organizations, so many peace builders from around the globe. Many of you have already submitted questions that we have on hand. You will also have an opportunity to submit questions throughout this event by using the feature at the bottom of your screen. Tell us who you are and to whom your question is directed. Now let us get started with opening remarks from Her Excellency Lana Nasebe, the UAE's dynamic ambassador and perm rep to the United Nations, a committed leader on women, peace, and security. Lana, welcome.
Thank you, Milan. I'm unmuted, there we go. Thank you, Milan. Thank you so much, Ambassador Milan, and welcome everyone to this series this morning. It's good to see everybody looking well, and I hope you and your families have all been keeping safe in these challenging times. We're also so pleased, not only for our partnership with Ambassador Milan, but also to see so many other friends who've been part of this panel series in the past joining us here today. I'd also like to thank the Permanent Mission of Ireland for co-hosting this event and the wonderful Ambassador Geraldine for being here with us, as well as, of course, our wonderful keynote speaker, Fumzile Mlambo-Nguka, Executive Director of UN Women, the star of the UN Women Firmament in the UN and the global feminist for all of us. So as Ambassador Milan outlined, this panel series is meant to evaluate and improve the architecture surrounding the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and specifically looking at post-conflict reconstruction. And of course, as ever, the context keeps changing and impacting the work that we do in ways that we couldn't have foreseen in the past. And today is undoubtedly unprecedentedly different. It's a context today to go into a deep dive on one aspect of reconstruction, which is, again, very relevant in today's post-COVID-19 world, or not really post-COVID yet, but in that beginning of that era, which is mainstreaming gender and empowering women in economic recovery. When we conceptualized the panel with the Georgetown Institute of Women, Peace and Security, we were still at a stage where scientists hadn't even named COVID-19. Now our UN community has named it. It's a global pandemic. It's already wreaked havoc in fragile communities around the globe, and it's generated a $6.7 billion humanitarian appeal, largely focused on conflict and post-conflict settings. So the UN doesn't really expect the pandemic to hit these vulnerable communities until the summer. And while many countries, including the UAE, have endorsed the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire to respond to COVID-19, it's unclear how long global momentum behind this initiative will last as many countries begin to reopen. And I think we have to be mindful of that. We have a limited window for this global coalescence, if you like, around a global response to COVID-19. And the pandemic doesn't change the underlying systemic challenges that are likely to make equal economic recovery for women even more difficult. Notably, COVID-19 hasn't hit the pause button on climate change, which has steadily and increasingly put millions of the most vulnerable women in post-conflict settings at risk of losing their livelihoods, and especially women working in agriculture. But the combination of these two existential threats only underscore that we must redouble our efforts to take advantage of this short window that we have during peace negotiations, after a conflict, when the rules, the systems and norms are being put into place to again affirm that women and girls should be at the heart of the new order, of any new order. So the first panel discussion that we held together looked at women's political participation in post-conflict reconstruction, from seats at the peace table to enabling conditions for female candidates to political office. But today, we're going to turn our lens and our speakers' expertise to the interventions that the UN community and domestic stakeholders can make to ensure that women have power in the economic sphere. Post-conflict economic recovery initiatives often fail to incorporate women either as beneficiaries or active participants in decision-making and program implementation. And the data on this is also clear. And especially in this era of COVID-19 and climate change, it is therefore critical that economic crisis response measures account for the unique situation of women in conflict and post-conflict zones, where the cost of women and girls being excluded from decision-making processes is highest. Our eminently qualified panelists come from diverse backgrounds and will review the experiences of community-driven approaches, the private sector and international organizations in ensuring adequate consideration of gender in economic frameworks. It's our intention that the subsequent publication of the outcomes of this panel series will serve as an important guide for the Secretary General's 2020 review of UNSCR 1325, as well as the appraisal of the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. In our view, and Ambassador Milan, I know that you're an advocate of this, the state of the world today demands more than ever that we recommit to these two agendas, and that the lessons of the last 25 years are put to use for women and girls at a juncture when their leadership and their consideration has never been more essential. So I'm really looking forward to an active discussion, and we're all honored to welcome our keynote speaker, the Executive Director of UN Women.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Elena, and thank you for bringing all those threads together and reminding us of this moment with COVID-19 surrounding all of us, and particularly those areas most in need, and the relevance of today's discussion on reconstruction and relief. post-conflict. We'll now turn to our other co-host, Her Excellency Geraldine Byrne-Nason, the indomitable Irish ambassador, permanent rep to the UN, and another very strong voice on behalf of implementation of 1325. Ambassador.
Thank you very much indeed, dear Milan, and thank you to my friend Ambassador Lana and the UAE mission for bringing us all together. We're really appreciative for the work that Georgetown Institute does in this critical field, and I'm always thrilled to be on the screen with that one and only global champion, Famzile, our dear executive director and friend. So delighted to be here. The good news, I guess, because it is a sober time, is that we have again during this pandemic seen women leaders, women peace builders really step up globally to protect and guide their communities and their countries through this crisis. As women, I have to say, we recognize this pattern. In post-conflict societies, women grassroots leaders often help guide transitions to peace. And now in the midst of another global emergency ongoing, as Lana put it, you don't push the pause button on climate change. We know that it's women who are continuing to drive forward mitigation and adaptation strategies. Now, as we're shifting our thinking into recovery mode, it just seems absolutely a no-brainer that women need to have their seat at the table in deciding how we can all build back better together. I would say that as the generation that will be most affected by climate change and by the post-COVID world, we must insist that youth and particularly young girls have their say in this important phase, the next chapter. For me, that all starts with women leaders, equal representation, and shared decision-making power. In my own country in Northern Ireland, in our peace process, women's voices were instrumental to achieving a durable peace. However, I believe that the involvement of women cannot stop with the signing of an agreement. I like to say you can't just add women and stir. The full and meaningful participation of women in political and economic governance is really essential for overcoming this extraordinary and frustrating inequality we face every single day. And that's why we have brought in Ireland women's participation at home and as part of our foreign policy to put it at the core of our government efforts, and particularly in the Global South in our development cooperation work that we do with our many partners. Melanie, you mentioned me as indomitable. I'm certainly sometimes not one who can hide her frustration. And I must say that the slow progress of gender equality remains a huge frustration here. This is a historic year. It's the 25th anniversary of Beijing, 20 years since that extraordinary resolution 1325. And yet we still see the fact is that women are disproportionately impacted by conflict, by ongoing climate. And now, what do you know? Women are disproportionately impacted by the economic fallout of COVID. So as we're seeking a pathway to recovery, this gives us actually a fresh opportunity. We have a chance now to integrate sustainability into our economies, promote a more resilient, greener future, but not without dealing with this inequality that we face for this next generation of women and girls. We recently hosted an event on building back better for adolescent girls after COVID. And at that, a dear friend of Georgetown, an Irish champion herself, Mary Robinson, the chair of the elders, remarked that women and young girls are already leading in their own way for a more resilient future. So for me, as I conclude, I say, it's not just that we seek them out to lead, but that we listen to them and that we find ways to amplify their voices and to get on with the job. So thank you very much for including us. Delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geraldine, and for your and Ireland's ongoing leadership in this space. And now we turn to our very special guest. Indeed, a star in the firmament, as Ambassador Elena said. We're very indebted to you. Phumzile Mlambo Nguka is the Undersecretary of the United Nations and the head of UN Women. And I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for the way that you have forcefully spoken out in recent weeks about the need for an inclusive response and recovery strategies to COVID-19. So thank you for that, Phumzile, and so much more. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for the encouragement. And it's wonderful to see Ambassador Lana, as well as to see Ambassador Geraldine. Thank God for these devices. Otherwise, it would be too much not to see each other for such a long time. And I'd also like to greet the fellow panelists. Women's participation in decision-making in post-conflict and every day and everywhere is essential. In times of a pandemic of this nature, the need to intensify the presence of women could not be overemphasized. Starting with the participation on women who are in the front lines, providing essential care, saving lives, and in many and most countries, these would be women. It is important that they are also in decision-making because they do have the holistic understanding of what women need in times like this. We have seen in many countries that because of the high representation of women in the health sector, the majority of those who have lost their lives, who are health workers, are indeed women, as high as 70% in some countries. Women are also critical at this stage to actually influence how we manage care, because there is a lot of overnight responsibility for care in this situation, people not being able to go to hospitals and therefore being cared for at home, the emotional and terrifying stress that many people have that requires someone to be in charge. And of course, we do have groups that are vulnerable, people who live with disability, the aged, all of whom need a special care. Whether women are in the health services or elsewhere, this care also falls on them all the time. Women are also responsible for the livelihoods and addressing food security in the families as food dwindles. In many of the countries, one of the unforgettable pain we've seen because of this pandemic is hungry people, hungry children, and that too becomes a responsibility for women. There is the issue of girls and education, something that we've fought so hard for. This has been the biggest talking point for us about what did we get out of Beijing. We were able to put girls' education and the girl child at the center of many of our responses. The threat to girls' education as children stay out of school for a long time, the risk of early pregnancy, trafficking, early marriage is something that should keep all of us at night. And in areas that have been affected by conflict, we all know how much that is also a big challenge. And of course, another area that we are particularly worried about is maternal health. In the last 20-25 years, we have been working so hard that we could begin to say, we can see, even though it's not there yet, but we are seeing a direction. When hospitals are overburdened and other illnesses cannot be accommodated, women's health is at a higher risk because women would have to go back to giving birth at areas that are not as safe. And of course, violence, men's violence against women, women in isolation, trapped with their abusers, and in countries where we've not yet succeeded to declare services needed by women affected by violence essential services, we are still facing that challenge. We're also seeing in some countries that the resources that would go to women's shelters are being diverted to address COVID and to isolate people who need to be quarantined. And we're fighting as hard as we can with those countries. I must also say that there's also many countries who have increased their support, that we've been working with, to have had hotlines, shelters, as well as to make sure that women can be accessed even in their homework. Now, climate change forces women in some cases to leave their homes, to separate families. We've seen in South Sudan, in nomadic communities, men who go looking for food and leaving women in very difficult situation. However, in some cases, women have turned this into a source of empowerment for themselves as they had redefined what the family is and the role of the women in the families. We are anxious to see that the very big stimulus packages that have been announced by many governments make sense to women. Women in the informal sectors, women who are migrants, women who are also working in places where they are underpaid, at the bottom of the pyramid. Women in tourism, which is a sector that has been affected. I am asking all of you if we could work together to unpack and to identify areas in which these packages can either be strengthened, repackaged in some way. And we are hoping that in a couple of weeks, we are going to be sharing a guidance note to member states and anyone who cares to listen about how we could make this an essential part of building back better. Building back better for us means that we have economies that are responding to the climate challenges. We do not build better if we go back to dirty industries. Building better, it means that we build economies that empower women, that women in conflict find their place. Building better means that we address the fundamental inequality in our society and that we address digitalization in society in such a way that we close the digital divide. Thank you, Milan.
Thank you so much from Zelly. Be safe there in South Africa, and we'll look forward to being back together physically one day, all of us. And thank you again for your leadership. So with that prelude to our panel discussion, I think it was particularly fitting that Phumzile accentuated building back better, even in these dark times of the impacts of COVID-19 still being felt and still growing in many respects in some parts of the world in very serious ways. And Build Back Better is about this period when a country is moving out of conflict, this particularly significant transition period. And one way to build back better is obviously to create economic opportunity that enables a durable peace to come out of these times and enables people to see the possibilities of peace being a part of their lives again. And so we want to focus on that right now with respect to women and economic opportunity. I'm going to start with Maria Helena Semedo, who is the Deputy Director General for Climate and Natural Resources at the Food and Agriculture Organization. She is coming to us today from FAO's headquarters in Rome. Maria is an economist with a distinguished career in her government in her native Cape Verde over many, many years. In addition to other positions, she held various ministries in 3 different positions, and now at the FAO. Maria, I want to ask you in terms of post-conflict countries. We know that women in many, many places are rooted in the agriculture sector, and in fact, disproportionately impacted in that way also by climate change, because it has huge impacts on their work in farming. But they're not just victims of their circumstances. They are implementers of solutions that can make a difference in creating greater productivity and economic opportunity. So tell us, from your experience and leadership at the FAO, what is needed for women in the ag sector to successfully navigate both climate change impacts and the fragility coming out of conflict in their communities? And perhaps you have some examples you could give us of how this could work in a much more concrete and successful way. So Maria.
Thank you, Ambassador Melanie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Ambassador Lana, Ambassador Geraldine, dear Ponzili, dear fellow panelists, and dear participants. I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation today to represent my organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and to talk about women, agriculture, and conflict. As you rightly said, women represent 43% of the agricultural labor force in developing countries. But unfortunately, they are affected by poverty, exclusion, climate change. They don't have access to resources, and they have a gap in the productivity because they cannot have the same resources as men as agriculture producers. If you look at food insecurity and what are the drivers of food insecurity, the first one is conflict. We are talking about conflict. The second one is climate change. And the third one is economic growth, as you can imagine. And if you think about Darfur, maybe you don't remember that Darfur was the first climate change conflict. Why? It was driven by water scarcity. When we talk about climate change, we talk about drought, floods. We don't have access to water. We don't have access to productive resources. And this is affecting more women because they are not resilient to climate change. And what is needed? Let me be maybe more forward looking. How we think we can support women to be to face the gender gap. They have to have access to productive resources. When I talk about productive resources, land. They don't have access to land for different reasons. They don't have access to agriculture input. They don't have seeds, they don't have fertilizer, they don't have access to credit. They don't have access, as Fuzili was saying, to innovation, information, because they were not educated. They cannot have access to all the resources, and also finance and advisory service. And then, because of that, they cannot be engaged throughout the value chain. They cannot produce, they cannot go to the market, they cannot be engaged in sustainable agriculture. And if you see, they don't have access to fuel and energy. And this is what I can talk to you about crisis-affected population. They have severe constraint in access to fuel and energy because they need fuel and energy for cooking, for heating, for lighting, and for power for the entire family. And because of that, they have a burden because they need to collect the wood, they need to collect the water, and they need, because of the displacement, they are more exposed to gender-based violence. And this is also one of the consequences. They need to be displaced and they are violented several times. And when they need to go and to have access to energy, what they are doing, they are cutting forests, This brings to forest degradation, they are contributing to soil erosion, and they are aggravating food security. And if you look what is going on COVID-19, when you destroy forests, you are facilitating the spillover. We can even say that indirectly, they may be contributing to have more zoonotic diseases. But you ask me, for example, as ambassador, I just wanted to share with you an example what FAO has, a project we call Safe Access to Fuel and Energy Initiative. With this initiative, we ensure access to fuel, energy for cooking, for heating, for lighting, and for crisis-affected population. What FAO does? We train women refugees in the camps to have access to fuel-efficient cook stoves, seedlings management, replanting, agroforestry practices. We have construction of household biogas and also solar photovoltaic pumps for water provision. And with this project, we have reached 370,000 households. Women have decreased the time burden for cooking, for gender-based violence has decreased, and climate and economic resilience has strengthened. I can also tell you with a project we call Dimitra Clubs, where we promote community-run clubs. Through those clubs, women, they exchange views, they are empowered, they enhance leadership, and they contribute to improve livelihoods and gender equality. And we are also using those clubs to mobilize, share health and safety messaging to help prevent the spread the virus on the communities, to show how we can use hand washing, community radio. This to say that if we empower women, they are able to take care of the family, they are able to cook, they are able to improve the livelihoods of the family because they can produce, they can go to the market, they can earn income, and they can improve their own leadership. As Ambassador Geraldine was saying, through this Dimitra Club, they have amplifying their voice in the community, and through the community to the family and to the countries. I think this is what I wanted to share with you now. I don't have much time, but let's see together how we can empower women's voices for them to have equal access to resources, to be full producers, and to be resilient to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, and for kicking us off in this part of the discussion. And I think those 3 points are critical as we continue to talk through prospects for economic opportunity. So from the ag sector, I want to move to public works. Dr. Nesreen Barwari is speaking to us from Iraq today. She is the former Minister of Municipalities and Public Works in Iraq. And in that role, she was in charge of spearheading much needed public works improvements in her country and in creating a nationwide jobs creation program, again through public works. She was the first and only woman appointed to a ministerial position in Iraq following the 2003 regime change, and today she's a professor of planning and governance. Now, Nesreen, as minister, you oversaw a very large-scale reconstruction projects, many of which meaningfully included women. Now, this is rare. It's a place to where we need to get in reconstruction efforts post-conflict, and yet women did have opportunities in these public works projects in a meaningful way, and I think that's important to stress, that their role was such that it mattered greatly. So what did it take? What did it take in Iraq, which is not an easy place for this to happen? What did it take to involve women in the recovery? And what worked best? What made it happen? What can we learn from your experience?
Thank you, Ambassador Elena, for hosting this discussion. Greetings from Iraqi Kurdistan, where I am talking to you from. So thanks for the technology that allows my voice and who I represent in all my different layers to be heard in your event. As you mentioned, in September 2003, I was appointed as Iraq Minister of Municipality and Public Works, the only woman. And at the time I was the youngest too. So I inherited a very devastated ministry of 45,000 employees, 100,000 properties, and numerous pieces of public works machinery in various states of serviceability. Throughout the economies, 250 municipalities where most of Iraqis resides, the Ministry of Municipality and Public Work was responsible for drinking water supply, management of environmental sanitation services, sewage and solid waste, and urban planning and development. And also it guided the decentralization process that was taking place by guiding municipal councils and local governments to establish their power at the local level. So as a minister, I led the renovation of ministry facilities that was heavily looted and trashed, but very importantly was also to guide the staff, to reorient them and reinvigorate the demoralized staff. And it's very important to mention that of the 45,000 employees, 60 to 65% were women. So the role of women as as public works engineers and administrators was very important to showcase and to make women leaders of those public efforts. That was the first visual and effective role to play. But of course, through modernizing the outdated system, through building the capacity of the technical staff to deliver those very much needed service in a very highly politicized environment, under very formidable personal and security threats and severe resource constraints. So we try to maintain public service to the extent possible. Many examples could be given, but very important, obvious examples were that when the ministry took lead role in restoring essential public service following very highly destructive armed conflict in cities like Najaf and Fallujah. It was done by my ministry under my leadership, but through the staff that I had where I involved women and men in the process. But during that period, the three ministerial appointment in Baghdad, of course, we had to get attention to the sectors and to get much needed activities, but I mean resources, and then use those resources in a very effective way, with the lack of planning, with the huge devastation that the country was facing. All of this has to be done in a very integral way. So promoting public ethics, integrity in the ministry contract and operation was also a very important message to give as we are rebuilding the new Iraq and reestablishing the ministry role as a service provider by making the citizen the center of our service, not the project, but the citizen. And this really took a lot of reorientation in the staff's mind, but also building that network of communication, trying to reach out and connect to every stakeholders that is having a role in the reconstruction process. As you mentioned, of course, being the only minister, women, I also took up roles of trying to find ways of promoting women voices and women role in the new Iraq. So I took up the role of convincing the Iraqi Governing Council of the vital role of women where they should play in rebuilding the country and help introduce working with women NGOs across the country on the quota system that required that all Iraqi representative body should include at least 25% women, and which is a system that continue to work now where women are playing 25% in the parliament and the provincial council. Obviously, transitioning from a traumatic past to promising future did not just happen by itself. Governing through crisis has been a regular feature of Iraq since 2003. And it hasn't been always handled well, but of course, there was inadequate capacity, shortcoming, mistakes, missteps, but there also has been successes. As you know, the first challenge was really to control terrorism, develop Iraqi security service, but build democratic free Iraq, revive Iraqi economy, encourage entrepreneurship, establish adequate safety nets for the less privileged, and achieve economic rehabilitation. So the short term was really creating employment opportunity and keep people off the street and to refurbish public services. And that's created a lot of jobs, which was for men and women. And of course, this all needed to take place in a very respectful way for long denied basic human rights for all Iraqis. So before regime change, services provision used to be politicized. So this is another challenge, is that we needed to do all of this in a way that respects that every human being in Iraq deserves basic human right, but also basic services. So all of this also took place by trying to find ways of improving sense of ownership of the solution. So by encouraging local initiative, by strengthening and emerging Iraqi civil society, and try to connect government with the civil society, which was also very new for a country that used to be run in a dictatorship like under Saddam. So massive public work rehabilitation helped spur wide-ranging economic activity, empowered key agents of change, including women. And for that, decentralization was essential. So we paved the way for decentralization. For the remaining time that I have to share with you, I believe that two main reform issues, the reform happened because of two factors. The one is really that should be a popular-based, broad-based popular sentiment that things have to change. So you have to establish that understanding among all people that think as they are not working and things has to change, and then back it up with a leadership that could translate this broad dissatisfaction into concrete program. Of course, recent experiences in many conflicts has shown that reconstruction and development assistance can be used to support peace initiatives. Until conflict is resolved, we should not wait. So development, reconstruction could be really very much tied to peace building. And that's a way of breaking the vicious cycle of violence and poverty, especially for women-headed households. And there are many of this in Iraq. So the key finding that I find from my experience in that role was really is to look at the local context, focus on the local context, do lots of consultation with this key stakeholder. We call it participatory approaches now, but then the name was not so known to us, but that was really one of my approach. And I think that was my special treat, and many women bring that, is the communication, is the trying to involve everybody in the decision-making process. Local population and civil society should be included in decision-making processes. Reconstruction should be designed based on local conditions. And reconstruction need to be linked to economic development that matches local understanding. And post-conflict resolution, reconstruction is a lengthy and costly process. So that's why we all need to be committed to the full cycle of it and not just leave it half done or half complete. And international actors should remain flexible because the dynamic changes, and for that we need to be flexible. Obviously, we cannot just think of today's immediate without thinking of the medium and long term. So looking at microeconomics to encourage growth, that was very important. Now, reconstruction in general could have negative environmental impact. So it's very important to think about this right from the beginning and take that into account. Corruption is endemic in post-conflict societies. And for that, we need to be also have context-specific accountability measures. all of this cannot be done without strengthening local institutions to maximize the long-term benefit and to make better use of the available resources. So capacity building was also one of the important initiatives that we led by creating a human resource development department for continued learning, continued capacity building, because it's very challenging and complex, and you need all kinds of skills. And with this large number of people cut from technology, from capacity building, they need a lot of capacity building. So this needs to continue, not only during the Reconstruction period, but for forever, because things keep changing, improving. Definitely, it's important to introduce the specific needs of women in post-conflict reconstruction, especially in the transitional period, because that's the time where you can really make change and reform, and things are under change. But also because women get more affected during those critical times. So it was very important to include women in the decision-making process at different level, at the village level, at the provincial level, at the, and one way if really to open up the discussion and about what do we need to do, what kind of changes we need to create. But of course, empowering the ministries and the staff who are women, because they champion the role and they play as a role model, and they impact their colleagues who are men. But when they go to the villages, to the cities, to the municipalities and talk to the head of the provincial councils, to the tribal leaders, they already are making an impact. So definitely having women representation in the governance and in the political processes is still very important to create that mass. And provide that venue for that voice. And at the end, of course, effective post-conflict leadership should be committed to addressing the inequalities and exclusion, and so that we can foster social dialogue and reconciliation. We cannot just keep this issue away. There is always somebody being excluded, and there are inequalities. So this should be at the heart of our policies. And I stop at that, and I'm sorry if I took more than 3 minutes.
Well, thank you so much. And I think this should be an extensive case study that you produce at some point, because as you just spelled out many of the steps you've gone through, it takes multifaceted efforts and a lot of key ingredients. And it is not just a magic bullet that one can say, this is what we do. So thank you for that. And we've gone from agriculture to public works. And now I want to look at large scale reconstruction investments and inclusion. Dr. Ann Kyriakos is the Senior Social Development Specialist at the Climate Investment Funds. The CIFs, as they're known, are implemented with the multilateral development banks. She herself has significant experience and expertise in climate adaptation, rural development, water resources, all of those key components. She joined the World Bank in 2005 and has extensive country experiences from much of the world. And let me ask you, at the CIF, you are responsible for mainstreaming gender across the climate investment funds. As the development banks are a major source of public finance in post-conflict countries, this is obviously a very critical component. So what needs to be done? What needs to be in place to ensure that large-scale reconstruction investments include gender responsiveness, climate resilience, and peace building? 3 big areas. And what role, if any, does the private sector play in all of this?
Thanks so much, Ambassador Vivier. This is Anne, and very pleased to have joined the panel this morning. We are based at the World Bank, as you've mentioned, and very proud to be able to share a bit of experience from past 10 years of investments in climate mitigation and adaptation. The portfolio is around 300 projects financed at the level of around 8.3 billion. And with a very significant commitment to gender equality and empowerment outcomes for women in particular across that portfolio. What we've seen through these investments in renewable energy and in forests and in resilience activities overall is that there are many different entry points and opportunities to ensure that equality outcomes are really designed for from the start. And this really requires a sort of sandwiching of objectives. So I see it as a multi-layered approach where you've got a strong institutional mandate from the policy side in countries to start with, the correct incentives in place. When I speak with public servants in countries, they say, well, we're embedded in these systems and we have to report upwards, and where we've got kind of monitoring that's happening that's tied to gender, but also kind of in the case of Nepal, looking at socioeconomic status and ethnic minority status. These are all sorts of signals that are given by countries to make sure that social cohesion is happening and that cleavages that might have been there in past conflict settings, for example, can be knit together, hopefully over time through increased investment and outreach. At the same time, it's the transfer of funds, but also very significant investments in kind of agency capacity building and outreach. So when we've looked at investments, for example, in energy efficiency, making sure in Kazakhstan that women are really targeted as consumers and as decision makers in some of our district heating projects in those countries that are undergoing these reforms. The area of forest management as well has offered a lot of opportunities of linking up these multiple entry points. So in Mexico, for example, even though obviously not a post-conflict country, there's still disadvantaged regions spatially when we look within countries, Oaxaca, for example, and other areas where there's a significant indigenous population and where there's a possibility for exclusion. And so when you have investments that are focused on area-based development, but also simultaneously looking to support women's leadership through devolved processes and investments in, for example, value addition and forest processing and marketing. There's opportunities there to make sure that it's not just the what of what you're doing, but the how, and that you're kind of seeing women across value chains in a way that leads some institutional hope for the future. And so women have spoken to me in Mexico around the norm change that happens at the community level, where women see men in the community see them now as decision makers, as leaders, not just at the household level, but in community settings and in small scale kind of factory settings where they're turning forests into furniture through access to resources they didn't have before. So those are just a few examples, but I think what matters too is thinking about the sorts of latent conflict that can be there. And I think it was Maria who was talking about natural resources and the sorts of climate threats that can lead to conflict, whether we're talking about water scarcity or slow onset desertification in the Sahel and these sorts of places. So we've had lots of investments in adaptive social protection that allows for both, you know, the cash for work kind of reductions in shocks to household budgets, but also improvements in area resilience and women's leadership through the identification of specific sub-projects. So it's that double investment in both the institutional and the physical on what's happening on the ground while protecting livelihoods, which is particularly important in this COVID context as well. And we've seen that scaling up across the board. In terms of private sector participation, I would say the on the mitigation side, our large-scale investments in renewable energy have seen lots of private sector participation. We have partners, of course, like the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, EBRD, that primarily working in that space. On the climate adaptation side, it's been a little bit tougher, but things are starting to move. So for example, in Tajikistan, credit lines through intermediary banks that are targeted on kind of lending to women and looking at climate resilient technologies at the household level. And that's been moving along. But we're also looking at things like opportunities in the renewable energy sector and energy access. And so in Haiti, there's off-grid solar retail enterprise opportunities for women, where we were able to kind of take NGO examples and models and scale them up through both public and private finance to make sure that these were both income opportunities for women, but also helping with energy transition.
Well, thank you for all of that. And we have lots more to learn about this space, but it's like the appetizer before the big dinner. This gives us much to think about and to work through. I'm just going to do a quick lightning rod because we're almost out of time. And I want to ask each of you, as we go into this review period on 1325, what advice do you have to the UN community, to advocates like all of us, in terms of one thing that can be done to really enhance women's economic opportunity as we go through this transition period post-conflict? Let me start with you, Maria.
Okay, I thank you for the question, and I think the first thing we need to see, women has been seen as key actors and drivers of post-conflict recovery and sustainable development.
Okay.
If they are considered key actors, agent of transformation, any policy, any approach has to be gender sensitive.
So we need to really get that through to the decision makers.
To the decision making. And is a smart decision, and it is a matter of social justice.
Okay, Anne, back to you. Yeah, I would come back to this idea of making sure that there's information flow across all levels. So I think it's important that it's not just participation in the formal processes at the highest levels, but also that grassroots interests and needs are being fed up, and that those kind of regional and district level decision-making points where a lot of local budgets are being decided, for example, also include women's participation. So it's that mix of the participation and the institutional change that's important.
Wonderful. And Nazreen. We can't hear you. No, it's your.
Still? Okay.
Now you're on.
Sorry. So for areas going through conflict, I really see the main issue is the complementarity between humanitarian and development and peace action. This is very important because this then create spaces for everybody to get involved, not only one layer of the society or one expertise, but when you complement the humanitarian and development and peace action, you can involve everybody. And definitely the role of women there is very important. Now, I think that we still need to do a lot of gender-based analysis, gender-sensitive analysis for the root causes and structural drivers of conflict, because so that we can create the resilience and also identify the collective outcome that can incorporate humanitarian development and peace action. And since a lot of the areas that have conflict has large size of rural community, I think we need to really look at unlock the capacity of rural women in this process.
Thank you. I want to give our audience some time and not shortchange them. So we're going to take the remaining time to ask a few questions. Ali, you've been looking at the submissions. Perhaps you can group them and we can start with the first round.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm going to group them by category here. We have quite a few. So the first question, this was covered a bit at the beginning, but how specifically is COVID-19 affecting your work? And what opportunities does it present to advance inclusion and resiliency? Specifically, how do we move beyond normative support for the Build Back Better idea and have significant contributions for women's economic empowerment in fragile and climate vulnerable communities? The second question here is on the care burden that women are facing, both in conflict and COVID-affected contexts. How do we ensure that post-conflict economic recovery plans address the needs specifically of female-headed households as it relates to livelihoods, childcare, and elder care?
Okay, let's start with those two. Fumzili talked some about Build Back Better, the terrible negative impacts that COVID-19 has, but looking to the future, and Reconstruction is all about the future as well. How does this impact and how can we get to a different place going forward? And then the second issue being the care burden. You know, this happens a lot in post-natural disasters as well, where women need to be part of that process going forward, but because of the care burden, often are not able to do that. What can be done to affect that situation? So whoever wants to start, and either of the issues. Anne, I guess I'm looking at you.
I think can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, the COVID context has really brought a focus for us on adaptive social protection and thinking about ways that these systems of safety nets can really be used and scaled up in this context. And so this is not just thinking, you know, only in terms of supporting individual households, but also, you know, what does this look like in terms of the macro fiscal systems and the resilience of, at the country level to withstand these shocks. And it ties in very well with the sort of whole of government approach that we've been taking in many of our investments, including in the pilot program for climate resilience, where we're looking at adaptation and resilience planning across sectors. So this multi-sectoral approach is very important. And this is really part of the idea, you know, when you think about adaptive capacity in a broader sense, it can be, you can look at different units of analysis, you know, what do women and men face at the individual level, household level, area level, and at the country level. And this is really an opportunity to think about investment priorities in terms of sectors, and are we just thinking in the short term, or is this also an opportunity to think about those medium-term threats and opportunities that are coming up in the horizon? And here, of course, for us, climate change is also very much tied into this. The context, as I mentioned before, of the just transition and the sorts of priorities we have around low carbon development, and making sure that those sorts of investments that start moving away from you know, fossil fuel intensive investments to cities and regions that are both more sustainable, but also including all in the employment opportunities, is something that we're giving a lot of thought to, and that takes a considerable amount of coordination upfront.
Strikes me as sort of the definition of resilience to be able to factor that in going forward.
Yeah.
Others want to speak to either
Can
of the
I
questions?
jump in?
Please.
Yes, I think we need to support women in a way that we can anticipate and support them to overcome COVID and to be better prepared, as we said, to build back better. One of the things we can do, looking that due to a health crisis, some of the protection measures are affecting the food security. We are moving to a more local production and trade. When we are promoting local production, how we can support women to have access to the inputs in a way they can produce and they can sell to the local market. To me, is a way we can support women to build back better. The second is how we can have green jobs throughout the value chain. We are talking about the green value chain, how the nature can build back better. And to me, we have an opportunity to green value chain, green jobs to support women. I can just give you an example what FAO is doing in Senegal. We have women producers, they not sell to the market because they cannot go to the market. We have a project where we are supporting social protection to vulnerable families. We are buying a basket to those women and to deliver to the poor families. They are having income, they are becoming more resilient, and in the same time, we are having a social protection schemes to the ones on need. Women will be empowered, will be having their revenues after the COVID. We need at the government support them how to have appropriate policies, how to have a gender sensitive decision, and also the oriented policies to address gender-based violence. We need to protect women through violence. The gender-based violence has increased during this period. How we can engage international, national, and local organizations to have COVID-19 women in their response. How we go to the international, global, and local level. And this is important that we reach the communities. And how we can invest in women leadership. I think we need to reinforce women leadership during the COVID in a way that they can be better and they can be stronger, to be more resilient to climate, to more resilient to shock, to be more resilient to food insecurity. And it's only to strengthen leadership and the job opportunities that we can help them to build back better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nesreen? Can't hear you. We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Myself.
Now, no, please, no. We can now hear you.
Nazreen, try to click unmute one more time.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so just to add to the two previous comments, I will just say that I think we still don't know a lot of information. A lot of information are still unfolding, and specifically, we need to do really disaggregated data is needed to see the actual impact on women and men before we can come up with recommendations or what are we learning from this process. So as we are in the center of all this, but there is a lot to be learned also. How is it impacting us so that we can come up with and looking at it as an opportunity. Definitely the increase of violence is an issue even happening in Iraq, and there is a lot of report of that. The hardship, the economic hardship on women, and especially women-headed families. A lot of people have lost their income. There's a lot of informal economy led by refugees and IDPs families, and they have lost that opportunity because of the lockdown. So a lot of economic support is still needed. But to look at it as an opportunity, it has all taught us how to use different means of communication. So we are now reaching out more because everybody is connected through the internet, through phones. So that could be an opportunity for women who will not be able to come to a venue and speak and voice her voice. That's something we are exploring now as we are doing some community-based activities to support families, that we can at least connect. So a woman who cannot come and travel or is not allowed to by her male member in the family to take part in a discussion or an activity, now through this virtual world can do that. So that's one positive outcome that has taught us that we can just use any mean to talk. And this is safe environment for speaking, where we can provide safe zone for women to talk about their grievance, about their challenges. So this is one positive thing I see coming out of this.
Okay. Does anybody want to take on the childcare question? Not so much with respect now to COVID, but in the Reconstruction period, how to engage women by helping them with meet their childcare needs? Anybody want to tackle that? Okay, we'll move on. Allie, maybe one more question.
Yeah, we have one final question here on the role of technology and the digital economy in supporting women in inclusive and resilient economic recovery. So that applies to both post-conflict and a post-COVID world.
So technology, Nazreen, you finished on that point. Does anybody else want to pick up on it? The role of technology? Can't hear you.
I believe technology is important to the gender divide. But women, if they don't have access to education, it's difficult for them to have access to the new technology, whatever technology it is, technology in agriculture, technology on communication. How we can have the technology, and also not only in terms of education, but of the price of the technology, how it will be accessed. But to me, the importance is how we improve education, how we can have policies which can be facilitating women access to technologies, whatever technology they are. And as I said, to be better producers, to increase production and productivity, to be climate resilient. But in my view, we need to have policies, we need to have investment, and we need to have the appropriate environment to improve women in order that they can be equally having access to the technology as them.
And this is one of the areas where tech companies have been involved in the past, both in terms of accessibility, costs, but also many of them engaged in capacity building, because you can't build back better in leading to a better future if women are going to be deprived of that ability to access the 21st century jobs. Are you seeing any of that in terms of the CIF investments?
We haven't seen quite as much as that. I mean, what I've seen more broadly, I guess, is lots of innovations in the area of youth employment and kind of these meetup spaces where there's lots of innovation in generating apps and creative industry employment in some of the Caribbean countries, for example. On a more, ag focused level, I've seen with the self-help groups in India and in some of the places in East Africa as well, the use of mobile technology for both, of course, financial services and banking, but also market information. And in this case, sometimes the asset of a cell phone might actually be shared by a number of women in a group. I think over time now this is moving as the costs come down to individuals and to women and having these items themselves. But that digital divide question is an interesting one, and it's interesting in how the technology is used. I agree with the point that education is the first investment there. At the same time, though, I've also seen people with fairly low literacy skills be able to use some of these mobile applications for economic productive purposes. So it's a brand new world, I think, in terms of what's possible on that front. But this is where the country context and meeting countries where they are is so important. We do still see that huge rural-urban gap in educational attainment and in women's participation in education at the higher levels, and this is something that's not going away. And yet some of our member countries, for example, again in the Caribbean, are now also starting to push around the gaps they see in boys' education. And it's actually shifting in some of those middle-income countries to where girls are receiving education at higher levels than boys, and the employment impacts that has. So gender now is a complex and varied topic that we need to make sure we're looking at it from all angles.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned mobile technology, because I think it's really an essential tool for development for women everywhere, but certainly in the developing world. And in this context of post-conflict, it's both a source of information, but it's often a source for women in agriculture, for example, to know where the markets are, to get the information on weather, whatever it is that they need that they wouldn't ordinarily get. But also for banking today. And if they're going to be able to transact or save safely, it really, I think this question really goes to the heart of so much that needs to be done as societies reconstruct after war in terms of creating that better future. We could go on with this topic. It is so multifaceted, but I think we've touched on many, many key points. And I want to tell you that we not only want to wanted to inform through this process today, but we hope that some of the ideas that you brought out can accelerate greater opportunities, economic opportunities, resilience to climate in that period that we're looking at as societies reconstruct and recover from a conflict. And I think that this has been a really invaluable investment in that today. We will be with the UAE going forward and producing a significant report after this series is concluded in those various areas that matter greatly to post-conflict recovery. And that report will include the kinds of ideas that you put forward today, and others from the field who are contributing to this space as well. So thank you very much for enhancing that. To the panelists, to Maria, to Nazreen, to Anne, thank you for all of your good ideas today and for the commitment you bring to your positions. To Fumzili, who I know will go on demonstrating very strong leadership. And to Ambassadors Lana and Ambassadors Geraldine, it's a pleasure always to work with both of you. And both of you are tremendous leaders in this space. And we will look forward to our next in a series on what's to be done in this post-conflict period that is certainly inclusive of women and can make a difference to bring about better outcomes. So to all of you who have joined us today, until next time, stay well and ever onward. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.